The Unseen wasn't just a forgotten horror film, it was a trapped echo locked inside a farmhouse that never wanted to tell the truth. It emerged in 1980 like a whisper, too soft for mainstream audiences, but too disturbing to completely ignore. Behind its modest budget lay a production marked by rewrites that spiraled out of control, clashing egos, and a creature concept no one could fully agree on. Scenes were shot, reshot, cut apart, and rearranged until even the cast admitted they no longer recognized the story they had signed up for. Why did a film this chaotic still manage to leave behind a strangely magnetic trail of rumors, and what exactly was being hidden behind its walls? These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about The Unseen. Fact 1. The Unseen began with a script that nobody could quite control, a story that shifted shape every time it passed through another pair of hands. What started as a straightforward thriller slowly mutated into something stranger, darker, almost feral. The film was originally intended to explore psychological isolation, but early drafts kept drifting toward creature horror, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by accident. Producers wanted a marketable monster, writers insisted the terror should remain human, and the director hovered somewhere between the two, torn by the fear that choosing wrong would doom the film before it ever reached a theater. As pages were rewritten, the tone fractured. One scene felt like a domestic drama, the next like a feverish nightmare. Even the actors admitted they weren't sure which movie they were in. That uncertainty seeped into the final product, giving it an uneven, hypnotic tension that critics would later describe as accidental surrealism. The oddest part, much of what feels unsettling today wasn't planned. It was the result of confusion, disagreements, and a deadline that arrived long before clarity did. In a strange way, the movie's identity crisis became its most haunting quality, an unintentional aesthetic born from chaos rather than design. Fact 2. The farmhouse used as the film's primary location wasn't chosen for atmosphere. It was chosen because it was isolated enough that no one would complain about late-night shooting. That isolation, however, became a curse. The house was old, warped from decades of neglect, and filled with pockets of cold air that seemed to drift without logic. Crew members repeatedly reported footsteps in rooms they had locked, lights flickering even after electricians rewired entire sections, and windows that refused to stay closed. At first, everyone blamed wind, faulty structure, or the stress of working long hours, but even the practical-minded grip team began whispering about the place after equipment toppled with no one nearby. The director tried to use the unease to push performances deeper, urging actors to let the house get into your bones. It worked, but too well. Several cast members later admitted they had nightmares involving specific rooms they never wanted to re-enter. Oddly enough, when the production wrapped, the property owners claimed the disturbances stopped immediately. Some crew joked that the film had collected the house's energy and taken it with them. Whether symbolic or not, the feeling lingers in the finished film, a subtle sense that the walls themselves are waiting for something. Fact 3. The creature design, one of the most debated aspects of The Unseen, went through so many iterations that the final version almost felt like a compromise between competing nightmares. Early sketches leaned heavily on body horror, with deformities exaggerated to grotesque extremes. Later concepts were more human, focusing on emotional tragedy rather than shock. The special effects team kept oscillating between these poles, unsure whether the monster should evoke pity, revulsion, or both. Budget restrictions made everything harder. Materials were reused, prosthetics were patched rather than remade, and lighting had to carry much of the burden. Ironically, the limitations created a creepier effect. Shadows concealed imperfections, making the creature appear half-formed, as if struggling to exist. Actors described filming scenes with it as unsettling, not because of its appearance, but because the partially obscured details triggered imagination in ways a fully lit creature never could. The final design remains divisive. Some call it underwhelming, others insist its ambiguity is what makes it memorable. The biggest twist is that the production's inability to finalize a definitive look accidentally produced something more haunting, a monstrosity defined not by what is seen, but by what is missing. Fact 4. The Unseen became a battlefield of creative tension long before cameras rolled, and nowhere was that clash more apparent than in the arguments over tone. Producers pushed for a conventional creature feature, terrified that anything too psychological would make the film unmarketable. The director, on the other hand, believed the story's real horror lay in the secrets a family chooses to bury. Meanwhile, the writers kept rewriting dialogue to sharpen emotional trauma, while effects teams prepared prosthetics meant for shock value. Every department seemed to be making a slightly different movie. Revisions arrived so late that actors received new pages minutes before shooting, altering motivations they had been building for weeks. Scenes meant to be dramatic were suddenly reframed as suspenseful, and moments designed as grotesque shock pieces were dialed back into tragic quietness. This constant shift infected the pacing, creating abrupt tonal pivots that would later confuse critics but fascinate cult audiences. The strangest outcome was that, in trying to please everyone, the film accidentally captured the disorientation of characters trapped in a household where nothing stays consistent. What looked like indecision on paper translated into unease on screen, and perhaps the biggest irony is that the tension that nearly tore the production apart ultimately forged the film's eeriest signature. Fact 5. Few viewers realize how heavily the unseen depended on improvised camera solutions, not artistic choice, but survival instinct. The production's lighting equipment malfunctioned so often that the cinematographer resorted to using practical lamps inside the farmhouse to shape entire scenes. These makeshift lighting strategies created deep shadows that swallowed half the set, obscuring details that were never meant to stay hidden. In wide shots, cables and rigs couldn't be fully concealed, forcing the team to crop frames tightly around actors, unintentionally boosting the film's claustrophobic feel. Even the camera dollies broke down midway through filming, leading to handheld shots that were initially seen as technical compromises, but later praised for giving the film a raw, trembling intimacy. Crew members joked they were building a movie from scraps, but the resourcefulness became part of its texture. Mistakes produced visual irregularities, flickers, uneven exposure, and unpredictable reflections that weren't planned but looked uncannily intentional. The director embraced these accidents, claiming they mirrored the instability inside the family narrative. Whether that was genuine insight or clever justification remains debated. What can't be denied is that the film's most atmospheric images emerged not from design, but from necessity, and the camera's struggle became part of the story's pulse. Fact 6. The actors faced challenges far beyond memorizing shifting dialogue. They had to adapt to a production that seemed to reinvent itself daily. Many came with expectations of a straightforward thriller, only to discover that emotional weight was being added to their roles in real time. One actress recalled rehearsing a scene meant to portray mild suspicion, only for the director to suddenly demand raw fear because the creature subplot had just been rewritten. This abruptness forced performers to access emotions without preparation, which created a strange authenticity on screen, a genuine confusion that mirrored their characters' disorientation. Tensions grew when scenes requiring physical intensity were scheduled without warning, leaving actors to handle stunts and close-quarter struggles without the rehearsal time they expected. Some moments in the final cut, praised for their realism, came from actors reacting not to scripted terror but to real frustration and adrenaline. Off-screen, friendships formed out of mutual survival, while others fractured under pressure. And though the cast later admitted they wished the process had been more structured, several agreed the unpredictability carved out performances that felt oddly lived in. The production may have been chaotic, but that very chaos became the emotional backbone the story desperately needed. Fact 7. The emotional strain on the cast deepened once night shoots began, because darkness transformed the already isolated farmhouse into something far more oppressive than anyone expected. Actors reported a growing sense of dread during late hours, not from the creature effects or scripted suspense, but from a gnawing feeling that the environment was reacting to them. One actress described hearing whispers behind a closed door moments before a take, only to find the room empty when she checked. Another claimed that props shifted position between rehearsals even when no crew members had entered the space. Exhaustion blurred lines between imagination and experience, creating an undercurrent of real fear that bled into performances. The director encouraged them to lean into it, insisting the film's emotional truth depended on capturing that raw, unfiltered discomfort. But privately, several cast members worried the relentless schedule was eroding their grip on what was scripted and what was spontaneous. The final footage reflects this blurry tension. Characters look genuinely shaken, not because of choreography, but because the cast felt trapped inside a place where logic and mood dissolved after sundown. The irony is that the most convincing terror in the movie may not have come from the creature at all, but from the cast confronting an atmosphere that seemed determined to unsettle them. Fact 8. One of the strangest challenges during production involved the sound department, which found itself battling an acoustic puzzle no one anticipated. The farmhouse absorbed sound unpredictably, swallowing dialogue in some rooms while amplifying faint creaks in others. Boom operators discovered that footsteps in the hallway could echo louder than lines spoken inches from the microphone. Attempts to dampen noise failed because the structure itself seemed to vibrate, carrying vibrations through walls in ways that defied standard recording logic. As a result, many scenes required extensive post-dubbing, forcing actors to match emotionally volatile performances weeks after filming. This disconnect between on-set fear and studio precision created a tonal friction the team struggled to reconcile. Yet, the inconsistencies inadvertently enhanced the sense of instability running through the film. Sounds appeared from angles that didn't match the camera's perspective, making viewers feel something was always slightly off-screen. The director later claimed this was intentional, an auditory metaphor for secrets echoing through generations, but crew members admitted it was mostly a desperate attempt to salvage compromised tracks. Still, the uncanny soundscape became one of the film's quiet strengths, a reminder that even technical flaws can morph into storytelling tools when framed by the right kind of chaos. Fact 9. The actor portraying the hidden family member carried one of the heaviest burdens on set, not only because the role demanded physical contortion, but because the character's emotional backstory was constantly shifting with each script update. Early drafts depicted the figure as purely monstrous, a tragic accident turned feral. Later rewrites humanized the character, emphasizing neglect and desperation rather than monstrosity. The performer had to balance these competing interpretations, adjusting posture, vocalization, and movement depending on which version of the creature the day's pages reflected. Long hours and cumbersome prosthetics added another layer of strain, limiting vision, mobility, and even breathing during complicated sequences. Yet, the most haunting quality the actor produced wasn't in the makeup, it was in the way he conveyed a fractured innocence beneath deformity. His portrayal hinted at a person shaped by confinement rather than malice, blurring the audience's sympathy in unexpected ways. Ironically, the ambiguity audiences discuss today stems from the production's inability to finalize a single narrative direction. By forcing the actor to inhabit conflicting identities, the film created a creature that felt more emotionally complex than anyone intended. Its tragedy wasn't scripted, it was engineered through uncertainty. Fact 10. The creature's lair, one of the film's most unsettling locations, was never intended to be a set at all. It originated from an unfinished basement on the property, discovered only after a crew member followed a draft of cold air seeping from beneath a loose floorboard. The space was cramped, irregularly shaped, and littered with remnants from decades of neglect, rusted tools, broken shelving, and warped beams that looked almost skeletal in the dim light. Instead of building a studio version, the production embraced the accidental discovery, believing the deformity of the room echoed the creature's fractured identity, but shooting there was nearly impossible. The ceiling was too low for standard lighting, forcing cinematographers to rely on handheld lamps that cast jagged shadows across the walls. Actors had trouble navigating the uneven ground, and prosthetic pieces tore against the rough surfaces. Still, the environment added a visceral tension that no artificial set could replicate. What appears on screen as a carefully designed nightmare was, in truth, a space that fought back against the crew at every turn. And the twist is that its realism didn't come from craftsmanship, it came from a room that seemed to reject the idea of being filmed at all. Fact 11. The unseen's editing process became a labyrinth of contradictions, with multiple conflicting visions battling for dominance frame by frame. Early cuts leaned heavily into suspense, drawing out long stretches of silence and tension. Producers pushed for more action, insisting that audiences needed clearer, sharper scares. Meanwhile, the director argued for emotional continuity, wanting the creature's reveal to carry tragic weight rather than shock value. This tug-of-war created a patchwork timeline where scenes were rearranged repeatedly, sometimes stripped of context, sometimes stitched together from fragments shot weeks apart, Continuity errors multiplied, and the editor joked that his real task wasn't crafting a narrative, but taming a hydra of competing intentions. Yet, something unusual emerged from the chaos, an unpredictable rhythm that made every transition feel slightly unstable. Mirroring the film's themes of hidden fractures within a seemingly ordinary home, critics later argued the film felt dreamlike, though the editor privately admitted that dreaminess was simply the byproduct of running out of time. The strangest irony is that the film's disjointed structure, born from conflict, pressure, and exhaustion, became the very element that gave it a cult following. Sometimes, the cracks tell a better story than the surface. Fact 12. The props department faced a peculiar challenge when creating the objects that filled the farmhouse. They needed items that suggested a family history without revealing too much, a balance between normalcy and quiet decay. Many props were sourced from estate sales, chosen specifically because they carried an inexplicable heaviness. Old portraits with faces nearly faded away, children's toys with missing parts, hand-stitched quilts fraying at the edges. These items weren't meant to draw attention, yet the camera often lingered on them unintentionally due to the tight framing required by the malfunctioning equipment. As a result, seemingly insignificant objects became silent storytellers, hinting at years of secrecy and neglect. During filming, actors began incorporating the props into their performances, touching them hesitantly or avoiding them altogether, depending on the emotional tone of each scene. What the audience perceives as deliberate symbolism often originated from instinctive choices made in the moment, and in a film built on the tension between what is seen and what is hidden, these accidental details gained unexpected power. The twist is that the farmhouse's history wasn't scripted, it grew from the objects that filled it, each one whispering a fragment of a past the film never fully explains. Fact 13. The director's quietest creative decision ended up shaping the film's emotional foundation far more profoundly than expected. He insisted that the underlying story should never fully explain the family's dysfunction, believing unanswered questions would haunt the audience longer than clear exposition. This approach clashed with producers demanding explicit backstory, but the director held firm, asking actors to imagine private histories that would never make it into the script. Each performer built a personal mythology, secret grudges, unspoken tragedies, quiet compromises that subtly influenced their interactions on screen. Scenes once written as simple exchanges became layered with tension, because the cast was now responding to invisible emotional wounds known only to them. Crew members sometimes noted that certain glances felt too heavy for the lines spoken. Unaware of the invented histories driving them, the absence of clarity frustrated early test audiences, who wanted neat answers, but later viewers embraced the ambiguity as a defining strength. The irony is that the film's most resonant emotional threads were crafted in silence, not in dialogue. By refusing to reveal the family's darkest truths, the director allowed the story's fractures to linger in the spaces between words, turning what might have been melodrama into a tapestry of unresolved unease. Fact 14. One of the most controversial cuts made in post-production involved a sequence that originally revealed far more about the household's hidden inhabitant. Early edits featured an extended scene in which the creature interacted with objects in its secluded space, offering glimpses into its isolated daily existence. Some versions showed it attempting crude drawings. Others depicted it handling keepsakes with a gentleness that contradicted its monstrous exterior. The footage painted the character not as a villain, but as a neglected, childlike figure longing for connection, yet producers feared audiences would sympathize too deeply, undermining the intended horror. As a result, the scene was removed, leaving only fragmented moments that hint at the creature's vulnerability without defining it. Cast members later lamented the loss, believing it added emotional depth that could have transformed the film's reputation. What remains on screen is an incomplete portrait, an outline of a tragedy viewers must fill in themselves, and in a twist that likely would have pleased the director, the creature's humanity became more haunting after being obscured. Its missing story speaks louder than any full explanation could have. Fact 15. The film's score underwent a turbulent evolution, mirroring the production's wider identity crisis. Composers were initially instructed to create something minimalistic, relying on sparse instrumentation to evoke psychological dread, but midway through the process, producers demanded a more conventional horror soundtrack, filled with jarring stingers and crescendos. This contradiction forced the composer to oscillate between restraint and excess, often within the same cue. Some tracks emphasized atmospheric drone, while others erupted with sudden orchestral violence, creating a sonic landscape that felt disjointed yet strangely compelling. During mixing sessions, the director fought to preserve the quieter compositions, arguing that silence itself could carry more weight than melody. Ultimately, compromises scattered fragments of both visions throughout the film. The result is a musical identity that never fully settles, drifting unpredictably between moods. Mirroring the fractured emotional world of the story, critics dismissed the score as inconsistent, but later audiences found themselves drawn to its unpredictability. The real twist is that the music's unevenness wasn't a flaw so much as an unintentional echo of the chaos consuming the production. The soundtrack became a mirror, reflecting the film's broken structure through sound. Fact 16. The film's release strategy became a cautionary tale about how a movie can disappear before audiences even know it exists. Distributors struggled to decide whether The Unseen should be marketed as a creature feature shocker or a psychological thriller. Posters leaned heavily toward monster imagery, yet early trailers emphasized the mystery of the missing women, creating mixed expectations that baffled potential viewers. Theater owners, unsure of the film's identity, relegated it to limited showings and off-peak slots, further choking its visibility. Critics who did attend screenings often judged it against the genre they assumed it belonged to, not the conflicted hybrid it actually was. As a result, reviews were scattered, inconsistent, and sometimes contradictory. Word of mouth never gained momentum because audiences couldn't agree on what they had watched. Yet, the confusion inadvertently planted seeds for cult appreciation decades later. Those who rediscovered the film found themselves drawn to its refusal to conform, its jagged tones, its fractured storytelling. In a strange twist, the very indecision that buried the film on release became the quality that kept it alive among enthusiasts who cherish cinema that resists easy categorization. Fact 17. Behind the scenes, financial pressure dictated more creative decisions than anyone wanted to admit. The budget was so tight that the production often had to choose between completing a scene or repairing equipment that had broken mid-shoot. Producers insisted on finishing each day's quota, regardless of setbacks, pushing the crew into a relentless cycle of improvisation. Makeup artists reused prosthetics beyond their intended limits, patching tears with whatever adhesive was available. Wardrobe pieces were stitched repeatedly, sometimes altering the appearance of characters in subtle ways that later complicated continuity. Even the food budget dwindled, forcing cast and crew to rotate meals in ways that became a running joke and eventually a point of tension. Yet what the audience sees on screen hides these constraints remarkably well. The film's rough edges, which might have been glaring flaws in a more polished production, became textural details that enhanced its unsettling atmosphere. The irony is that the financial limitations, far from crippling the film, helped craft the grittiness that now defines it. What was once a desperate stretch of resources became a testament to the crew's ability to engineer atmosphere out of scarcity. Fact 18. The controversy surrounding The Unseen did not stem from graphic content alone. It came from the uncomfortable themes embedded within its narrative. Some viewers argued the film exploited disability for shock value, while others believed it depicted the consequences of neglect with unexpected empathy. Scholars later dissected the film as an example of horror wrestling with societal taboos, particularly the fear of what families hide behind closed doors. These debates intensified when behind-the-scenes accounts revealed that the creative team never fully agreed on the film's moral stance. Some saw the creature as a tragic figure shaped by abandonment, while others insisted it represented unchecked brutality. The result is a story that teeters uneasily between sympathy and revulsion, refusing to offer viewers a comfortable moral foothold. This ambiguity made the film difficult to categorize, frustrating contemporary audiences but intriguing later generations who appreciated horror that left questions hanging in the air. And in the end, the unresolved argument at the heart of the production became the film's most enduring strength, a reminder that horror is often most powerful when it forces viewers to question not the monster, but themselves. Fact 19. The Unseen's legacy grew quietly, nurtured not by box office success, but by viewers who stumbled upon it by accident. Late-night television broadcasts, dusty VHS rentals, or conversations among horror aficionados searching for overlooked gems. These accidental rediscoveries created a fragmented but persistent fan base that appreciated the film's imperfections as much as its ambition. Many of these viewers were struck by how the film's rough texture and strange emotional tone set it apart from more polished releases of its era. They saw value in its rawness, its uneasy atmosphere, its refusal to conform to genre expectations. Over time, critics began re-evaluating it, reframing its flaws as evidence of a troubled but intriguing production. Discussions emerged about its thematic exploration of isolation, secrecy, and familial dysfunction subjects often overshadowed by the creature's presence. Scholars even noted parallels between the unseen and more celebrated psychological horrors, arguing that its unconventional structure offered unexpected depth. The twist is that the film's survival owes little to its creator's intentions. Instead, it endures because audiences embraced the very qualities that once marginalized it. Its cult status wasn't built, it was discovered, piece by fractured piece, by those drawn to stories that resist easy explanation. Fact 20. The film's most haunting element may not be the creature itself, but the way the narrative quietly dissolves distinctions between victim and villain. As the story unfolds, the hidden inhabitants' actions blur moral boundaries, leaving viewers unsure whether they are witnessing a tragedy born from neglect or a horror born from violence. This ambiguity seeped into audience interpretations for decades, prompting debates about the film's stance on responsibility, compassion, and the consequences of secrecy. Critics argued that the script's contradictions muddled its message, but others believed the inconsistency was intentional, a reflection of a family dynamic distorted by years of denial. The production's turbulent process only deepened this ambiguity, as shifting drafts and conflicting visions left traces of multiple narrative intentions on screen. As a result, viewers are forced to confront their own assumptions while navigating the film's thematic maze. The irony is that what some see as confused storytelling, others recognize as an invitation to interpret freely. In a genre often reliant on clearly defined monsters, the unseen stands out by refusing to provide clarity. Its lingering power comes from the silence between explanations, the shadows between motives, and the unsettling possibility that truth is not only hidden, it is unknowable. Bonus fact: there is one story about the unseen that almost no one involved with the production likes to discuss, a detail buried not in the script or the footage, but in a rumor that followed the film long after its release. According to crew members who worked late-night striking sets, the original ending was far more unsettling than anything audiences saw. Early drafts reportedly featured a final sequence revealing a second hidden inhabitant, an even more isolated figure living unnoticed within the walls, implied through fragments of movement, a half-glimpsed silhouette, and a series of faint, rhythmic knocks that grew louder as the camera tracked through the farmhouse. Some claimed the footage was shot but abandoned after producers feared it would push the film into territory too bleak and ambiguous to market. Others insisted the scene was never filmed because the idea frightened the cast more than the primary creature did. What remains consistent across these accounts is the uncomfortable feeling the concept generated, the notion that the horror the film explored was not singular but layered, multiplying in darkness. And while no evidence of the lost ending has surfaced, not in archives, not in cuts screened for distributors, the legend endures among fans who sense the narrative's abruptness and wonder what might once have filled its silence. The twist is that the absence of the scene became more powerful than any definitive reveal could have been, by withholding the possibility of deeper terror. The film left viewers with a lingering suspicion that something else might still be hiding, just out of frame, waiting for a story of its own. The unseen leaves behind a trail of fractures, unfinished ideas, buried emotions, and a creature shaped as much by silence as by violence. It's a film that refuses to resolve itself, lingering instead in the unanswered spaces where fear and empathy clash. Stories like this never truly end. They echo, reshaping themselves each time a new viewer steps into the farmhouse and listens closely to what was left unsaid. Tell us in the comments which fact unsettled you the most and which forgotten film you think we should dig into next.